Take my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile. Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Most modern cars are built with safety in mind. Safety is a broad term, as it can mean keeping the driver and occupant safe, safety for other vehicles and people on the road, and safety for the environment as a whole. Being safe while driving is important and has been since the first days of the automobile. So today, let's take a look at how the whole concept of car safety began. Now, there were some safety features already in existence prior to anyone bolting an engine onto wheels. Horse-drawn vehicles, particularly large ones, often had brakes. Now, I live in Ohio and see horse-drawn vehicles in Amish towns, and many, if not most, do not have brakes. The reason is simple. The horse is the brake when the buggy is light and additional brakes are not needed. But when hauling a large vehicle loaded with lots of cargo, a brake may be needed to assist the horse, ox, or whatever is pulling the wagon to help slow it down. These brakes were simply wooden blocks that would press on one or two wheels when a lever was moved by the driver. Similar to bicycle spoon brakes, block brakes pressed on the typically steel tire or possibly solid rubber tire by the 1870s to both add more braking power for large loads and also act as a parking brake when stopped on a slope. It made the stopping job easier for the horses involved and gave the driver time to block the wheels when parked on a hill. The earliest cars used brakes like this, or drum friction brakes to the rear axles a la Daimler, and this was enough through to the late 19th century. Cars in this era were not particularly fast, and stopping such a car was a minor consideration when just getting it moving was a much harder chore. The cars were light and slow, so brakes seemed the least issue to deal with, and braking systems developed at a bit more slowly than, other automotive technologies. But they did develop, and the factor that pushed their development forward was auto racing. Yet there were other safety features that predate the car itself: lights and horns. Many countries across Europe required horse-drawn carriages, coaches, and wagons to be equipped with one or both of these, though bells were also sometimes used as well. The lights were not particularly useful to see in the dark, but rather to be seen. Kerosene lamps, naphtha lights, and even candles behind glass were quite common. Though colored lenses to make the light red or yellow wouldn't become common until after World War I. Blue and green lights were also fairly common. Horns and bells had been on many commercial wagons since the 18th century. By the 1850s, horns with rubber bulbs on them for honking became somewhat common and were used on bicycles as well as wagons. Many municipalities required horns and or bells on wagons and bicycles by the 1880s. And since the automotive industry primarily grew from these origins, they were simply added to the earliest cars. Pneumatic tires were both a comfort and safety development that were developed from the bicycle industry and made their way to cars in the 1890s. It was John Dunlop that made the first practical pneumatic tire in 1888, and their use grew from there. His tires were for, of course, bicycles and tricycles of the time, and proved to provide both better comfort, road feel, and better traction to help avoid accidents. Michelin, Continental, and other companies made rapid improvements to the technology and made them more suitable for automobiles. In the mid-1890s, when car racing gained popularity in Europe and elsewhere, the cars involved became faster and heavier. And as the death toll rose from racing accidents, inventors began to work on the problem of making cars safer. Controlling a car moving at 20 miles an hour or so wasn't too difficult, but once cars began to speed along at 40 miles an hour or more, keeping them on the road became more problematic for the driver. Three particular inventions from the mid-1890s helped improve the safety of cars: the steering wheel, the panhard rod, and the bumper. It was in 1895 that Emile Levasseur first put a wheel on the steering column as opposed to a tiller, steering bar, or bicycle-like handlebars. The tiller was most common at the time, as it mimicked the motions used to control a horse pulling a vehicle. The advantage of a steering wheel was finer control at the high speeds cars were now able to achieve. Yet, the better steering control is what led to Emile's death when, in 1896, a Paris-Marseille-Paris race, he swerved to avoid a dog on the track and lost control of the car. He died of his injuries a few months later. His partner, René Panhard, determined that the reason for the crash was not the wheel for steering, but rather that the body of the car was not well connected to the wheels. Basic physics shows that if something is going in a particular direction, it will naturally want to continue in that direction. The problem with early cars was that although turning the steering wheel would make the tires turn and thus the chassis turn, the body of the car wasn't so inclined, and so rolling the whole car across the turn instead of successfully making the maneuver was inevitable at high speed. His invention, the panhard rod, cross-connected the body to the chassis so that the whole car would lean into the turn, making high-speed turning possible. Yet, crashes were still possible, and still are, so some method to protect the car, its occupants, and hopefully whatever was crashed into was also needed. This is where Hans Ledwinka comes into play with his invention of the bumper in 1897. Horse-drawn vehicles don't need bumpers. The horse does that job. But once the horse is removed, some sort of protection would be needed to help prevent damage to the car and whatever it hit in case of a collision. A few years later, bumpers were made with the first crumple zones. Bumpers designed specifically to absorb impacts at fairly low speeds first appeared in 1901 and are standard on just about all cars to this day. Windshields are important in automotive safety and first appeared on a car, a Ford Model C, in 1904. True, the first windshields were of regular plate glass and could cause more harm than good, but safety glass, laminated to withstand impacts without shattering, was invented in 1909 and continued to be improved over the next few decades. Now, let's talk about seatbelts. I've heard it said that they were invented due to the invention of the airplane to keep pilots from falling out of the aircraft during aeronautical maneuvers, and yes, they certainly were used in that capacity. But the seatbelt was invented in 1902, a year before the Wright brothers took flight, and it was invented by Walter Baker. Baker was a Cleveland-based builder of electric cars and one of the largest electric car companies in the world. Since 1899, Baker had been making electric cars, and he believed that racing and speed trials, or setting the world land speed record, was the way to get his cars promoted. However, racing had already proven dangerous. And so Baker came up with an idea. Install a wide strap across the seats so that if a crash occurred, the driver and other occupants wouldn't be thrown from the car and then have the tumbling wreck crush them, or worse. In 1902, his electric car, the Torpedo, was a very unique car. Built as aerodynamic as they could figure out in the day, it fully enclosed both the driver and mechanic that sat behind him. No other car had ever done this. With Baker himself at the wheel, he raced this machine on a public road in Staten Island to set a new world land speed record. And he did actually reach some 105 miles an hour in this contraption. Unfortunately, he did lose control of the car and plunged into the crowd at that speed, injuring many and instantly killing a Mr. Andrew Featherston, along with another man, John Bogart, dying hours later. Andrew Featherston is the first spectator killed during a car race on American soil. Yet Walter Baker and his mechanic, wearing their seatbelts, survived the horrific crash with only minor injuries. But what about environmental safety? I mean, to be honest, not much was known about such things in the 19th and early 20th century. Most cars had total loss lubrication systems, meaning that you had to constantly pour oil into the thing, since once the oil was used, it was dumped onto the road instead of being collected into an oil pan. Yet this was seen as a hazard in those cities that had paved roads, as the oil would make the road surface slippery. And it still does if your car's leaking oil. So many cities passed legislation against such crude dripping cars. Also, some cities were concerned about air pollution, even over 120 years ago. Though, to be fair, not for the same reasons today. London is a good example of this. The Great Stink of 1858 had not been forgotten in the late 19th century, when the sewage system failed and human waste flowed into the Thames. At the same time, the steam and smoke from the decaying waste caused a pandemic of diseases, and the idea of vapors coming from an automobile conjured up the same fears. Thus, in 1898, it became illegal to operate a vehicle in London that emitted any kind of smoke or vapor. So, car makers installed mufflers onto their gas cars. Steam car makers added condensers to reclaim the water. And electric car makers were as happy as a clam at high tide. Automotive safety today is a constantly developing and heavily legislated issue. Modern cars have airbags in various places. We have child seats, emission controls, ABS braking, traction control, and many, many other safety features in our cars. But let's not forget that the idea of car safety is as old as cars themselves. Think about it. If automotive manufacturers made cars that would kill their owners, they wouldn't have repeat customers. And that's bad for business. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week.